One of the things that I have appreciated so much about being in the Bitcoin space for over 10 years now is how much it has elevated my understanding of personal finance as well as macroeconomics. So a lot of you guys that have followed my channel for a while know my story, but in case you don't, back in 2004, I basically hit a wall. I had $174,000 worth of debt, and I had transitioned from a job in corporate sales into music when I moved to the Atlanta area back then after a really, really awful, painful divorce. And that was the time that I discovered Dave Ramsey's program, the 7 Baby Steps and Financial Peace University. And it was like revolutionary for me. I had never heard anyone talk about money that way. I'd never heard anyone say, openly in the consumer space, like, hey, you need to have $10,000 in the bank because statistically over the next 7 to 10 years, you're going to have a $7,000 to $10,000 emergency, and now this is 21 years ago that, I sort of hit this wall. So I discovered his program and it completely turned my life around, and I'm really, really, grateful to him and to his team for that. Now, I've since parted ways from that organization. I actually went through their financial coach master training program back in 2017. So I was sort of like, I was kind of all in. But there were some things that I started to see, just like, we say in the Bitcoin space, skewer your heroes. Like, there are no heroes. There are no heroes in any area of life, really. And so I went through that, paid off all of my debt. I kind of went all the way into sort of becoming one of their, I was never an employee for them, but I was sort of one of their financial coaches, sort of trained under that tutelage. But one of the things that you find when you start coaching people, individuals, families, is you start to see that you really have to be a little bit more flexible in your approach than I think he is. Now, he's got this, he's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. He's got, the number 3 radio program in the whole nation. So he's earned the right to be able to, talk a certain way and even be what I would argue a little bit grumpy and kind of abusive in some ways. So I started to really kind of build my own personal platform on the ways that I was different. I'm not saying that I was a better financial coach. I've never said that. I've never claimed that. But for some people, I'm a better fit for their situation because of the way that I walk them through that process. So when I went through that process of 2.5 years of paying off, it was $43,000 worth of consumer debt and $131,000 in a mortgage debt. So I was actually able to discharge that mortgage. I sold the condo. And then I was able to pay down $43,000 worth of debt. Now, this came just in time for the great financial crisis of 2008. So I was able to get out of my condo. I was able to get completely out of debt. And it gave me, sort of a head start in some ways because I was able to have at least a small emergency fund. I think I had about somewhere between 10 and 20,000 as a small emergency fund going through the great financial crisis. And man, that was like, if the first, 2.5 years of my going through that process, that was my microfinancial or my personal finance awakening. The next part of it was my macro finance awakening. I remember, watching C-SPAN, some of the hearings, the congressional hearings of these, investment bankers going before Congress, being grilled and, answering questions about, why they defrauded their customers and all the bail-ins and the car companies coming for bail-ins. And I started to really have an understanding of the financial system that I'd never had before. I scoured through resources like The Creature from Jekyll Island, so I started to have an understanding of the Federal Reserve System. I immediately became more of a hard money guy or an Austrian economics, an enthusiast of Austrian economics. And so at that time, there was, gold and silver was basically sort of the thing. And so I became, kind of a harder money guy, started peeling off some of our savings into gold and silver as a currency preservation, as a currency value preservation methodology, in addition to doing some investing as well. And then in 2009 is when the Genesis block of Bitcoin was mined and was sort of released. I started hearing about Bitcoin from Max Kaiser and Stacy Herbert on a show that they had on RT, which is Russia Today. It used to be all over YouTube. So this was probably around 2011 when I first started hearing about Bitcoin. I was intrigued about it, but I just didn't really have a grasp on the whole idea or practice of like digital scarcity and how something digital could not be double spent. So it took me a couple of years to kind of work through, some of that. And that was a really, Max and Stacy, I would say were responsible for, orange pilling me. But I would say, especially the last, more than a decade, I have lived as a content creator and as a coach, kind of trying to figure out, how do I straddle between personal finance and Bitcoin? Because there really has been, I think up until very recently, there hasn't really been much of a push or much of a, many content creators that are trying to bridge that gap between personal finance and Bitcoin and how to bring Bitcoin into your everyday personal finances. Now, I will say that with the advent of some of these, platforms, the fact that, Robinhood and Cash App and Venmo, you can buy Bitcoin, you can use Bitcoin, Lightning wallets, and all of those things, it's becoming much, much easier to start incorporating Bitcoin into your, daily personal finances. So I don't really have a point to this video. This is really just to kind of get to know you, like a little bit more of my story and kind of how I am learning how to navigate, through this sort of maze. And I think myself, as well as a good number of other, Bitcoiners are very passionate about helping bridge that gap between personal finance and Bitcoin and really bring those things together. Bitcoin is inevitable. It's amazing if you even just think about the settlement layer. Okay, so like you go to do a Bitcoin transaction, you can immediately go into the mempool and you can see the transaction taking place in process. Whereas if you go and do a wire transfer or some sort of ACH transfer, that's a black box. It goes to the bank. You don't have any purview into, okay, did they send my money somewhere else? Have I been defrauded? We have no purview. Whereas with the Bitcoin network, that's one of the million plus amazing things about the protocol that are just really worthy of your time to try to start under. So that's all I wanted to share today. Just kind of, peeling off some of my thoughts about how I got into this and kind of where I'm going with it.